Well, welcome everybody to the first of our webinars for 2021. And in this presentation, we're going to be talking through some of the key guidances that were issued across the board from the FDA in 2020, which was a very unusual year, a 1 in 100 year, I think. And so we feel it was a good opportunity now, starting a new year, to go through the year that was from a guidance perspective across the pharma, device and diagnostic areas, and talk about the key documents that were issued. So who are we? So we're Brandwood CKC. We're a regulatory and market access consulting business based in Sydney, Australia, but with offices throughout the Asia-Pac region and servicing the medical technology and pharmaceuticals areas across the globe. Presenting today is myself, Robert Stringer. I'm one of the directors and principal consultant specifically in the pharmaceutical space. My co-presenter today is TJ Thiel, another one of the directors who looks after the diagnostics and medical devices leadership process. Both of us have been working in the industry for a very long time, be 20 to 30 years, working in various territories across the globe, dealing directly with the FDA, TGA, and the EMA for various projects. Now, because the scope of this review is extreme, with the FDA issuing a couple of hundred guidances every year across the board, what we're going to try and do is focus on the ones that have had a significant impact or the potential for a significant impact moving forward, and ones that represent possibly a small paradigm shift in the way the world is operating from a regulatory perspective. We've broken it up into different areas, focusing on medical devices initially, then I'll talk to the pharma guidances, and then we'll briefly cover off the changes in the IVD space, which is very topical in the current situation. So I'll now hand over to TJ to talk about medical devices.
Thanks, Rob. Actually, we'll start off with a bit of an overview first, because I think, we've touched on this a little bit, but if we go to the next slide, you'll see that, ultimately, there's in the course of 2020, there's been a ton of guidances released by the FDA, and it goes to show that a lot of them are COVID-19 specific. So as a result of the pandemic, additional guidances had to be created to address, bringing products to market in the current landscape. But again, there were a lot of that were already scheduled to come out that ended up making it on there anyway. And so the FDA made an effort to do not only COVID-19 specific guidances, but other guidances in the course of 2020. As Rob suggested, we're going to start with the medical device. So if we move on to the next slide, you'll see here that there are, I've broken down the medical devices into two major categories. Obviously COVID-19 specific, and then I've talked about others that are important in the medical device space. Now, again, as Rob has mentioned before, this is not an exhaustive review. There were hundreds of guidances actually created. And so this is just us establishing or evaluating these guidances to identify which ones are important, but also which ones have the potential for changing not only US regulatory requirements, but also worldwide regulatory requirements, because obviously FDA is a leader, a thought leader, and a institutional leader for other regulators as they look at adapting their regulatory guidances. So as I said before, we'll start here with COVID-19 specific guidances. Now, the main considerations of the COVID-19 response from the FDA was to really just ensure that they could meet the public health concerns by making devices available. And again, there were focus on those that were used for treatment and or as personal protective equipment. So again, there are differences that have been created so that people could have access to these products and would not be burdened by a regulatory process that was keeping products from coming to market. There was a lot of, as COVID-19 is a respiratory disease, there was a lot of guidances around the infection and prevention of infection for those in the respiratory failure. There's also a lot of guidances or specific guidances around ensuring safe distancing and PPE between healthcare professionals and the patients infected. And then finally, there were some obvious modifications that the FDA decided to allow to support patients during this crisis. So these were the main considerations. Now we'll kind of go into some actual specific examples in the next slide. So there were a few enforcement policies to assist in the therapy of COVID-19 infected patients. And again, this was really focusing on, okay, somebody has got COVID-19, how do we make sure that, one, they're treated appropriately, especially if there are, a lack of, respirators, ventilators, pumps, things like that. How do we bring appropriate product to market that is basically seen as safe, but isn't available right now because they haven't gone through the regulatory requirements. So we did have enforcement policies on infusion pumps, on ophthalmic assessment tools, ECMO and bypass devices, and most importantly, there was one on ventilators and accessories for other respiratory devices. And again, the intention here was that the FDA wanted to show that they were flexible in putting product to market that was desperately needed under the current situation, but still advising what the minimum requirements are for a product like that to be brought to market. The other thing that was obvious in the assistance of COVID-19 infected patients is that because of the process and not needing to go through a full 510K or PMA, they made the EUA, they expanded the scope of the EUA, and the EUA is the Emergency Use Authorization. But what was really important here, and as part of the guidances the FDA created, was they added a lot more meat or substance to what they expected. So they created templates, especially in the pre-EUA meeting and ventilator space. They created templates that manufacturers could use to show that they met all of the basic requirements, but they also created templates for interactive reviews of the non-IVD products and surgical masks. So again, it was FDA's intention to provide industry as much guidance as they could so that they could use the EUAs to ensure that patients had access to these products in a time of this crisis. We'll move on to the next slide. There were other enforcement policies, again, related to COVID-19 because it was influencing or creating more opportunities for telemedicine. So, and people taking care of or having the options to have treatment in their own hands. So what we saw here was a lot of work around the digital health space, especially because there was, obviously with the COVID-19 thing, there was a lot of additional depression, anxiety, things like that. So they created an enforcement policy to speak specifically on the psychiatric disorders. They created some additional standards around the mammography and the Quality Standards Act. They spoke more detail at the telethermographic systems for triage. So again, these are those IR scanners or the automated IR machines that one would use to triage people at, based on febrile, if they have a temperature or not, whether or not they'd be admitted into a hospital or a governmental building, so on and so forth. So the FDA created another enforcement policy there. They looked at additional methods for transport media. There was additional work on the bioburden using for face masks, or I should say respirators. And then finally, they looked at creating some non-invasive fetal monitoring options for pregnant women so that they would not be subject to additional scrutiny or additional risk when it comes to giving birth. If we move to the next slide, the big thing here, and obviously COVID-19 itself is a huge impact on all regulators, and they've all put a lot of focus on this. So again, it doesn't surprise you that a good portion of the medical device guidances are related to COVID-19. In addition, there was a lot of Q&A and updates that were provided, not necessarily as a specific guidance, but just in general around the COVID-19 activities. Again, the EUA process was well explained, templates were created, policies specific to need were created. They also wanted to make sure that the industry understood what was happening with all the other products. And so again, they wanted to make sure that Q submissions were still out there and that they intend on operating within the MDUFA goals and timelines. It's not to suggest that there isn't a delay in getting those Q submission meetings happening, because we can say, from our experience, there is a bit of a delay in what would normally be 6 weeks, we would get a meeting. We're seeing it more at the 10 to 12 weeks, but they have decided, they've made it perfectly obvious that they want to make sure Q submissions are still going to happen. And then finally, I think the other one that is obvious and has happened by many of the regulators in the space is that they wanted to make sure that they could do these meetings and Q subs and all of the other advisory meetings virtually. So again, no longer is it going to be necessary for you to pack up and go down to White Oak in Maryland and have a face-to-face conversation with the FDA as part of a pre-sub or as part of the application process. So it's really focusing on providing a virtual presence and having that review happen on a video conference. Next slide here. Again, there's a couple of just updates that have been provided, especially around the shortage of devices. So again, one of the things that has come out of the COVID-19 process is the regulators wanted to make sure that products were available, but they also wanted to know when there was a potential shortage. And so this guidance or this update was actually a request from the FDA that manufacturers are required to notify if there's a discontinuance or an interruption of their manufacturing that could create shortages of devices that are needed in the public health emergency. So that was one of the things that they wanted to make sure it was clear so that they had full visibility as to where they needed to focus regulatory activities because of a shortage of devices. And then last, they added there's a bunch of other documents that are related. Again, we've focused on the high level ones here and the ones that have the most influence on our current or our clients' products, but you can find them all on their webpage. And one thing I will say is that the FDA has done a tremendous job in putting all of these resources in a very accessible and findable manner during this process. So it's a really good resource for you to look at. So we've talked about the COVID-19 specific guidances and how those impacted and why they were brought to bear. But I think that there's a couple of other ones. Like I said, the FDA didn't stop in creating their guidances. They really did follow up with those that they had already intended on doing or were part of the plan, years and years ago. So I'm going to focus on a couple of really important ones to the medical device space. And the first one's the 510K third-party review. Now, this is the whole idea, and FDA has been toying around with this for a long time because they understand that they don't have the manpower to review all of these products and their applications, that their expertise is better utilized in the high risk and the PMA and the 510K side of the world for higher risk devices. So what they wanted to do was to create this third-party review process where effectively FDA goes out, they certify or give recognition to a qualified third party to provide the initial review for a 510K submission. And those 510Ks will be focused on the low to moderate risk devices. So these are probably those that are borderline between a class 1, class 2, or have established long-term usage, and it's really a 510K that can be considered a lower moderate risk. And with that, then ultimately the third party can take over that responsibility. So you've got the timeline or a workflow on the bottom here. Effectively, it's the same as you would in a normal 510K. The only difference is that the third party makes all of the review. They make their recommendation to the FDA. FDA reviews the recommendation by the third party and then decides whether or not they want to move forward, because FDA does not want to give full responsibility to the third party organization. So once they've gotten the recommendations from the third party, FDA will make their reviews, and then if it's acceptable, then the submission will go to completion. If not, there will be a review process of the third party's comments and go back to the applicant in the beginning. The next slide here, we're going to talk about the ISO standards, specifically around biocompatibility. So in this space with ISO 10993, there's been a lot of work, and we're seeing regulators, not only the FDA, but TGA, European Union, et cetera, really focusing on the changes that are happening with the biological evaluation process. So 10993 has changed, has had some updates, has had additional memorandums and appendices added to the base standard, but ultimately all the regulators need to come back with their opinions or their views as to the changes to those standards. And this is the FDA's attempt. So effectively what the FDA has said in this guidance document is that they accept a risk-based approach to biocompatibility testing. So if you can determine that it's not of risk, that you may be able to do we'll call it a benchtop or an engineering analysis to prove that biocompatibility testing itself is not necessary. And this would be, very beneficial to manufacturers because if you take everyone who's got direct or indirect contact with the human body, you'd be looking at thousands and thousands of different, companies needing testing. So having a risk-based approach allows the manufacturer to determine its, the risk and whether it's been mitigated effectively or not, and then, do the testing when it hasn't been, but when it has, where it's, generally seen as safe in others, it's used in other medical devices or has years and years of established use safely, then you wouldn't have to do that testing. Now, the big thing here is that there was an old blue book memorandum back in '95 that dictated the requirements of biocompatibility. So this replaces that. And there are some significant differences. So it is worth looking at. But again, 10993 has changed. We know that. All of the regulators are kind of adapting to those changes. And what you're seeing here is that risk-based approach and really focusing on those that need testing need to make sure that they've done it adequately as per the new guidance. Okay, so if we move on to the rest of the ISO standards or the other things that the FDA's guidances have focused on in the ISO and consensus standard space, I think the first obvious one is that there is a guidance document around the recognition and the withdrawal of the voluntary consensus standards, and that's pretty self-explanatory. The other thing that I wanted to point out, and we've added a little bit more detail, is that there is a guidance that has created or discusses the establishment of the accreditation scheme for conformity assessment and the pilot program. Again, that guidance talks about the goals, scopes, procedures, and the framework the FDA is intending to do this accreditation scheme. And it is consistent with what we've seen in other pilot programs. One that's obvious that comes to mind is the Software as a Medical Device program. And that has had some very positive success. So hopefully this can translate to the same. We move to the next slide. Just a few other guidance documents that I wanted to call out here because they are important and they actually affect a lot of our clients. The first one is UDI, so Unique Device Identification Requirements. As you've no doubt aware, UDI has been made into a guidance for Class 2 and Class 3 devices, especially those that are high risk. And so what this additional guidance document speaks to the unclassified and Class 1 and the requirements around UDI. The next two are actually about the actual submission process itself. As we are getting, the entire regulatory world is getting away from paper-based submissions. There's a guidance around the regulatory submission in an electronic format and the e-copy program. And these are really important now. The e-copy it's been fraught with some problems, and we've always had issues in trying to use this, but the FDA is doing the right thing and creating new guidances and new pathways for the electronic submissions to come in. The last one is just a review of the FDA's decision not to issue certain export certificates. Basically, they have identified certain criteria that they will not issue these export certificates because they don't believe that they're appropriate to do so. And so the FDA has decided that they won't. Okay, so I think that covers the medical device side. Moving on to medicines, I'll give it back to Rob.
Thanks, TJ. It's certainly been a busy time in that process, and it's a great observation to see that while a year might start with business as usual and then pivot towards a particular focus, there's a catch-up period, and I think from what you presented there, the FDA certainly had that. And it's a bit of a similar story within the pharma world as well. So the year started like all the others, definitely a business as usual point here. And a lot of the focus for the guidances that were issued in the first couple of months of 2020 were probably best classed as housekeeping type activities. Not all of them, but a lot of them there were focused on procedural changes, issues with electronic dossier formatting, advertising requirements, and also the issue of another series of Q&As on various topics. Some areas, though, that some new guidances or some finalised guidances were brought up, gave you a little bit of a clue as to the direction that the FDA was looking for 2020 to be, focusing a lot on biosimilars, issues with the immunotoxic potential testing, and particularly the commercialisation aspects of some off-patent molecules. And it's those areas that I really want to talk to for here, because I feel that they are representative of a directional change there amongst the FDA. So the two guidances specifically to talk about here that talk about this commercial area. The first is a guidance that's put forward, currently only in draft form, but creates a process whereby applicants for biosimilar molecules, which are, for want of a better word, generics of biotechnology pharmaceuticals, that can actually target only specific indications instead of seeking to have approval for the complete set of indications that the reference product actually has. Now, in the past, that can create problems when you're considering yourself, for want of a better word, a generic equivalent, and yet you're having a different set of indications based in there. So this was a process that could simplify that and allow applicants to only target specific indications. And why would they need that? This is because there's so many patents associated with a lot of the biotechnology products, many of which are related to method of use. So with each indication or with each new dose regime, they'll be covered by additional intellectual property requirements. It allowed applicants to only be focusing on indications that for which the IP protection has actually expired. So that makes the commercialization process and a path to getting onto the market somewhat similar. So possibly trying to address this patent thicket, which is quite common with biotechnology products. And in a similar theme, the competitive generic therapies guidance came out, and this is now a final one, so been worked for a little while. This is a FDARA created new pathway where the FDA is trying to, for want of a better word, help companies co-develop generic presentations of complex products that haven't been subject to generic competition before. So they have a specific definition of inadequate generic competition to be eligible for these pathways. And what they do, the FDA offers product development support in that process. They'll accelerate the actual review time activities there, not necessarily been tied into the standard review cycles. And they also create a 180-day exclusivity process here, which normally wouldn't be relevant to these molecules because the vast majority of them are well and truly without patent protection. They've been around for a long time. But there's something specific about the product or specific about the complexity of trying to copy the product that have prevented competitors coming onto the market. That's two guidances that are really there looking at how you would go about reducing the barriers to getting follow-on molecules onto the market for these off-patent products, so that you can reduce the overall cost of medicines within the USA. And these issues are ones that are uniform across the world in some respects, where biosimilars have now, for example, been freely available for coming up to 15 years in the developed areas, but they haven't always had a lot of market penetration. So these are processes to try and accelerate that and address the gap between patent expiry and actual commercial availability of these molecules. But then, of course, when March hit, the COVID focus saw an almost complete pivot from the pharmaceuticals team at the FDA towards looking at how they can not necessarily lower the requirements, but adopt a much more flexible approach to the requirements to allow a balance to be struck between the exploding medical need for additional supplies and of a lot of the products that are required to treat COVID, balance that with the medical need process that's actually in there. And so the guidances were issued there about hand sanitizers, manufacturing requirements for them, and then a lot of requirements that were addressing the normally absolute requirements for research in the pharmaceutical space. So how you go about adverse event reporting during a pandemic, what you do with your REMS updates during a pandemic, how do you go about notifying and managing stock interruptions and supplies during these pandemic times, which was certainly a significant global impact from COVID. With the globalization of manufacturing supply chains means that problems in one territory can have a direct impact on supply in another territory, and that guidance there was specifically for that. There are also some practical guidances included in here, with a huge spike in requirements for oxygen gas cylinders and things like that. There were specific requirements for whether you might be able to utilize non-medical grade cylinders for emergency uses here. Rules for compounding products when you weren't necessarily available to, freely available to the market. So ways to allow pharmacists to actually get the compounding process happening. And of course, there were specific guidances on chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, as they were, we all remember now, were touted as being potential treatments there, which then subsequently didn't prove to be as helpful as originally thought. Requirements for GMP auditing as well. In the climate, it's very difficult to move around. Certainly internationally, the FDA's audit program wound back, and internally as well within the USA, significant changes there in the GMP auditing activities. And also, the clinical trial environment faced a very difficult problem with COVID, with additional testing activities, additional exposure challenges for patients included in the clinical trials. And so there are additional guidances there to help sponsors ensure that the integrity of the clinical trials wasn't challenged by some of these problems, or not challenged to a significant degree. So there's a lot of new guidances that were put through there, but the majority of those really temporary. Currently still in force, the majority of them are, but when we get through this pandemic cycle, they're likely to be rescinded, and business as usual, or the normal status of operations will be resumed. So then once we got into the second half of the year, it was almost like a return to normal, almost. So there's still quite a few guidances popping up with regards to COVID, but you saw there the backlog of products that, or of guidances that have obviously been in development during 2019 and 2020 were now sort of getting over the wave of COVID-19 requirements as the issuance coming out. And so there was a sudden spike of activity coming through here. In that period, there were more than 50 guidances were issued in the back half of the year. So I clearly can't go through all of those, but I've picked out 3 particular guidances here to put a little bit of a focus on, because the guidances of interest and ones that had an impact internationally. So the first one here is looking at the medicinal cannabis space, which in the last 5 years around the world has become an enormous focus of regulatory guidance development, but also a commercial opportunity, with many country agencies opening the door for medicinal cannabis to be used instead of it always being classified as an illicit substance. And so the first guideline here is really looking at how you're setting up specifications for cannabis that's sourced from plants themselves. So normally when you're looking at pharmaceuticals, you'll have a chemically manufactured product, and so you can quantify all the specific chemistry requirements for that. When you're looking at a product like cannabis, there's a huge variety of materials in there because it's naturally sourced. So this process was working out what are the quality requirements and quality considerations that need to be thought of for these plant-derived products there. And to be sort of defined in here, what you really needed to do was looking at molecules where you have a very, very low THC content. So we're not talking about the products that would still be classified as a highly controlled substance. So this is a draft guideline that's come out, and I'm sure will pique a lot of interest around the world. Second one, for those who have been working in manufacturing for the last couple of years, people would be familiar with this. This was the presence of nitrosamine-based impurities in a lot of human drugs. So these compounds are known as carcinogens, and the manufacturing processes have almost always been thought to remove those during the manufacturing sets for the active substances. However, there was some unexpected identification of nitrosamine impurities in a lot of very commonly used pharmaceuticals, including ARBs, ranitidine and metformin. I mean, ranitidine is even available over the counter, that prompted the FDA and other agencies around the world to tighten a focus on the presence of these materials. And so this guidance here is looking at how you go about detecting for these, and also looking at a risk-based approach of what sort of manufacturing processes have a high propensity to generate these impurities during the process. And it's very much focused on the chemically synthesized drugs here, not for ones that can be harvested from natural sources. And this guidance came out and was actually worked on with the other regulators around the world, because clearly medicines coming into the US need to be controlled at those manufacturing source stages. And so a lot of the international jurisdictions put their hands together and said, okay, well, let's come up with a way to control this, to minimize the problem moving forward. And the final guideline I've got here to talk about is really an interesting one for those working in the oncology space, where there's always a focus on trying to find good markers of the effectiveness of a product without having to have long-term studies to give you the capability to determine what the survival benefit might be for the product, or progression-free survival benefit might be for that. And so this is a guidance that's been developed for quite some time. You see it's been in development now for 9 years. And what this is looking at a specific surrogate endpoint that can be used in this one specific area, so neoadjuvant high-risk early-stage breast cancer, that can be used to predict the efficacy of the product moving forward. So what this opens the door for applicants to do is use this particular surrogate endpoint for their initial studies, and they can actually receive approval for commercialization based on that data, on the requirement that subsequent to that, they'll actually be performing the confirmatory trials, which will have that long-term data generated on overall survival, that normally a registration might have to wait 2 to 3 additional years to achieve that data. So what this does then is open the door for molecules to get to patients faster than they would normally be under the previous regime. It's really interesting outcome there. Of course, it's still confined to just this one indication, but I anticipate that there's a lot of work in the background on other oncology spaces to try and determine and finalize what these specific surrogate endpoints can be used for those areas. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of pharma over the last 12 months. There's a lot more guidances coming out now, and hopefully we'll see some finalised ones that have been worked on, a bit like that last oncology one for the last 9 years, and see them implemented as a set guideline. Now I'd like to hand over to TJ again to talk about the world of diagnostics.
Thanks for that, Rob. Yeah, so as we've talked about medical devices and pharma so far, I think it's important that we have a little bit of a conversation about the IVD guidances that has come about from the FDA this last year. The first thing I'll say, in the COVID-19 space, the FDA has been very, very active, except it hasn't been necessarily with guidances. It was actually more in templates for EUA applications. And these have actually been much more helpful to manufacturers, because it's very clear as to the amount of information that the FDA expects for these EUAs, the amount of time that it'll take them to review it, and just the basics as to what they would accept. And so if we look at these templates specifically, you've got your molecular diagnostic templates for both commercial manufacturers and laboratories. And again, this is focusing on those PCR or those types of tests that are done in the lab that for detection of COVID-19. Then you have the serology templates for the test developers. Again, this is typically on the lateral flow side. So these will be the antibody tests for IgA, IgG, IgM. And what the expectation is, what the requirements are for those products to get through on an EUA. The next one is antigens. Again, another lateral flow or could be other test methodology, but again, looking at antigens as a marker for COVID-19 infection. Then you have the actual specimen collection. Now, it's interesting to note that when FDA first started having these EUAs for COVID-19 diagnostic products, there was a big anti-home, piece to this. It was not expected that these would be self-tests, or it would not be expected that, there would be an opportunity for people to test at home. But we have seen the FDA become more progressive and create some more of these templates so that they acknowledge the need for these. And again, that's where the specimen collection, so the idea that somebody can collect serially and then send them to a lab for processing, they wanted to make sure that those products had enough details so that they could be used appropriately. And then they also put in some non-laboratory use, so point of care type diagnostic test manufacturing templates, so that they can ensure that the right information, the right amount of data is provided so that they can get these across the line for emergency use authorization. It's just important to note that all of these templates are part of their policy for the testing during the public health emergency. And I do anticipate that we'll see more templates, or at least revisions to these existing templates, as there becomes more specificity or sensitivity required for these tests. If we move on to the next one, here's a couple of guidances around regulatory submissions. The first one here is the recommendation for a dual 510K and CLIA waiver application. So the intention here is that they wanted to create a least burdensome, fast approach to getting both the CLIA waiver and the 510K. Ultimately, it's recommended, or it's possible for this dual application to happen for simple devices. And the guidance goes even further to describe the study designs for what data you're going to need to get that 510K clearance and the CLIA waiver at the same time. So it's a very strong product or guidance for products that would require CLIA waivers. The next one here is the recommendation for CLIA waiver applications of manufacturers of IVDs. And again, this is more about the definitions and how they make the CLIA waiver status appropriate. So again, they want tests that are simple and have very low risk of creating a false result to get that CLIA waiver. So again, the idea is that because it's not being controlled or validated, or has some aspect of the lab monitoring its performance, they need to be simple and they need to be as minimally error prone as possible. And so this guidance then further goes to say, here's some recommendations for the information that needs to be there, and then as an absolute, to get this CLIA waiver. And so these are very important for those products that are meant to be point of care, meant to be self-tests, and appropriate for a simple and non-error prone test. If we move on to the next slide, I think this has kind of been a focus of all regulators globally in the last 2 or 3 years, and that's really on the blood glucose monitoring and test systems. So the FDA, as well as TGA and European Union and other Asia-Pac regulators, have created specific guidances around the blood glucose monitoring for treatment of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. And so they have described in these guidances specifically their requirements for prescription of point of care use devices, and also those that are OTC, so those that are sold in the pharmacy direct to consumers, and how they need to be created and what specific things they're looking for as part of these applications to ensure public safety, and that they get the right result and they can continue to monitor their diabetes effectively. So again, not unusual that we've seen the same type of guidances in the European Union and Australia. So this is, is consistent with what we're seeing worldwide. And that actually goes to a good point here, which is, as we said before, what do we think is going to happen next, or what do we think happens from here? So if we move to the next slide, that's the question we're asking. What's next for 2021? And I think, obviously, in the pharma, med device, and diagnostic space, as the need requires, there will be more COVID-19 guidances. But we are getting back to a more, back to the other products, other guidances that they had originally planned getting prioritized. And as you've seen from Rob's presentation, there has been some that have been 9 years in the making, and they're finally getting across the line. So I anticipate that we'll see, as need comes, a few more COVID-19 specific guidances. I expect there will be some clarification and some restructuring of the existing templates in the IVD space and the medical device space as the need either decreases or increases. I expect that there will be additional guidances around self-testing for COVID-19, because that seems to be where the next step in the evolution of the regulatory process is going. But ultimately, I feel like it, as Rob's pointed out in his slides, I think we're getting back to business as usual. And I think there are some opportunities that we'll see, the FDA really focus on the things that other regulators have focused on or that they have been planning for a while. And that leads me to the last point that I just wanted to make. I mentioned it earlier, but the big thing here is that although we're focusing on FDA guidances, it is very reasonable, and it typically happens anyway, that other regulators will pick up these guidances and identify how they differ from their existing processes. So I do anticipate that in 2021, you'll see a lot of the other regulators, including TGA, PMDA, NMPA, Asia Pac, Singapore. I will expect to see some responses to the FDA's guidances by these regulators. And that's just, it happens, and we've seen this happen, but it's also good because it creates a more unification or more of a consensus of the regulatory pathway globally. And so that's what I'm expecting. Rob, any insight on your side for what you expect to see in 2021?
No, I think you've covered it there. What's interesting is that a lot of regulators have been focusing on ways to foster competition in the pharmaceutical space. And the FDA's guidances at the start of the year were quite clearly targeting that particular space, looking to try and create a process where healthcare becomes more affordable. I think now that the budget impact of COVID-19, when we even just move aside from the level of guidances that have been issued and the changes that have actually happened there, I think budget pressures are going to make that focus possibly more extreme. And so I think a lot of the agencies around the world will be looking at these FDA guidances in the pharma space that are focused in that area and seeing, well, could we see some commercial benefits to that from a public health perspective, particularly in the markets where there's a government funding ticket associated with pharmaceuticals, to really look at that as a way to help addressing the budget balance that's going to be happening and impacting all of the markets around the world because of the expenditure and the downturn in the economies associated with the pandemic. So I think we'll see high pressure activities that often drive change. We saw that in the GFC in 2008. There was a sudden shift, particularly in the European Union guidances, to try and foster this competition place. And so I would anticipate this being an even bigger hit to the world economies, to be a focus for the FDA and the other regulators for the next 2 to 3 years at least.
Yeah, excellent point, Rob. Well, I guess with that, I think that covers our webinar for this month. I wanted to point out that, again, this webinar, as well as all of our other webinars that dive into other topics into a much deeper level, because again, with 200 plus guidances, we weren't able to get into every single one into the level of detail. But if you have any questions or you have anything that you want to learn more about, please go to our website, brandwoodckc.com/videos. You'll find a lot more webinars, a lot more slide sets that can be specific to what you might be looking for. In addition, please know we're available for your questions. So if any one of these guidances you have specific questions on, or just have some general FDA or other regional questions, please let us know. You can go ahead and email us at help@brandwoodckc.com, or follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn and submit your questions that way. But either way, if you send questions, we will respond, and we're happy to do so. So with that, I want to thank you for your time today, and we look forward to talking again here in a month's time. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.